go to our second speaker, it is my pleasure to introduce Daniele Monticelli, the Professor of Italian Studies and Semiotics from Tallinn University, who has another impressively interdisciplinary range of interests. He is, I think, in Estonia mostly known as a translation scholar, but also a semiotician, but today he emerges to us as a critical theorist.
This conference is really very timely and very thought-provoking. And as always, I'm very happy to be in Tartu. So I will try, the idea of the paper is to read Western plague narratives from antiquity to the late modern period in order to see whether at all, when and how biopolitical motifs enter literary representation of epidemics and what they can tell about our current discussions on health and biopolitics. So it seems to be a must of this conference, but I will also start from a very brief, a very well-known theoretical divergence in the understanding of biopolitics. Marco and Michael have already done the job, so mine will be a very, very simplistic and just for the sake of clarity. So on the one hand, Foucault, the idea of the late modern period and the turn to biopolitics from the old sovereign power with its right on the life and the death of the subjects to governmentality, the government of men, the administration of life, quoting Foucault, the aim is to ensure, sustain, and multiply life, to put this life in order. And on the other hand, Agamben, the idea that Western politics has been from the very beginning, biopolitics, I brought a quote here, the production of a biopolitical body is the original activity of sovereign power. In this sense, biopolitics is at least as old as the sovereign exception. And the production of a biopolitical body means, in Agambenian terms, the inclusion of their life in the political sphere through its subjection to the unconditional power of a sovereign. So what is interesting is that both Agamben and Foucault have been interested in the biopolitical aspects of medicine. And in the way in which they approach the issue, we can see also the differences in their understanding of biopolitics. In the case of Foucault, there's this very interesting book about the birth of a clinic. And in the case of Agamben, already in the first volume of the Homo Sacer project, he has a chapter on politicizing death, where he used one of his very hyperbolic argument, stating that the comatose patients in contemporary hospitals are the most extreme form of their life. So Agamben's last book is a very controversial one, where he gathers his essays on the COVID crisis. It's called A che punto siamo in Italian. It's a very radical way of approaching the issue and of developing his reflection on the relation between health and biopolitics. Basically, he writes there that the pandemic has been an excuse for the transformation of our governmental paradigms. On the one hand, he repeats the old idea that the state of exception has become a rule, but on the other hand, he sets at the center of his transformation, that he calls a grande trasformazione, a big transformation, the idea of biosecurity, the idea that the threat to health becomes the reason for unprecedented limitation of our freedom. What interested me particularly in this book is the idea of social distancing, because for Agamben, social distancing is at the core of a new paradigm of government and the new model of what he calls anti-society. So the idea is that in social distancing, the preservation of bare life is obtained through the destruction of social, political, affective ties between human beings. the destruction of what has been already called here good life, or qualified life, as Agamben calls it. So plague narratives have been from the very beginning of Western literature a way of reflecting on the behaviors of sovereign powers and the people in a state of emergency where life as such becomes the main object of individual concerns and public interventions. So it is therefore absolutely not by chance, as Riley was saying, that countless references to such narratives have appeared in the media since the beginning of the current pandemic. I will use the narratives here to, first of all, test Agamben's idea that biopolitics is not a modern invention, but is actually inscribed into Western politics from its very beginning in the Greek polis. And on the other hand, I will compare different sensibilities of the authors of plague narratives toward different biopolitical aspects of the epidemics they describe. Particularly the issue, I will focus particularly on the issue of this social distancing. Of course, they didn't deal explicitly with biopolitics. They didn't use the concept of social distancing. But as we will see, there are a lot of biopolitical elements there, and also this idea of social distancing is coming up and up again in these narratives. So, and I want, so my aim is not to, so to say, take side or to give some kind of to make some judgments about Agamben or Foucault. So I'm also very critical of Agamben, actually. I'm not very fond of his kind of hyperbolic thinking. And I also find that Foucault is much more analytical, and in many ways it's much more useful for academic work. But still, I will try to look into this narrative and see which kind of Foucauldian and Agambenian elements we can find there. So the works I will consider present actually different degrees of fictionality and facticity. And when they narrate also real epidemics, then the relations between the authors and these epidemics is also different. In the case of Thucydides and Boccaccio, they were eyewitnesses of epidemics. Thucydides even got sick with plague, but he recovered, happily for us, and for him too, of course. And Defoe and Manzoni, they took real 17th century pestilences as a base for fiction. Their narrative is not based on personal experience, but they extensively use the documents of the times, and they also directly quote them a lot in their works. So it's a bit of mix between this fiction and documentarism writing. In the case of Homer and Sophocles, so the use of fictional epidemics for them is an expedient to set the narrative into motion. So I will consider these texts in a chronological order, but actually not for chronological reasons, but for thematic reasons that I hope will become so clear in the course of the analysis. So it is very significant for me that Homer's Iliad, and as well as Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, they are two pillars of Western literature, and they both start with the description of an epidemic. It's interesting. Moreover, and what is more interesting for us, the plague is represented in both works as a political issue, so related to the very destiny of a people and the city. So it is an issue which requires a sovereign decision on a state of exception, de facto. Of course, they don't present it in this way. So the Iliad begins with what Homer calls a naval pestilence, which eats the camp of the Greeks for 10 days. The pestilence is caused, as we know, by the god Apollon, who takes thus a revenge on the Greek sovereign, Agamemnon, because Agamemnon offended the Trojan priest of Apollon, Chryses, refusing to release the daughter of Chryses. The daughter of Chryses was called by the Greeks as a spoil of war and made by Agamemnon into a slave. So the god gets angry and punish the Greeks. So the epidemics is here a means by which a supernatural force punishes the whole community for the trespasses of its sovereign. Agamemnon violated family bonds as well as religious customs. The end of the epidemic requires the conciliation of the angry god through the unconditional return of a daughter to her father. But these things require a decision. So Homer's plague embodies a political crisis in the literal medical sense of the word. It is a decisive moment on the one hand and the moment for decisions on the other. It is, of course, the sovereign Agamemnon who finally decides to return the daughter to his father. But his decision, I would argue, is not a real sovereign decision because the circumstances and Achilles' intervention actually force the decision on Agamemnon. So the plague provokes there a state of emergency, clearly, but this is not an Agamemnian free and juridical empty space of exception in which the sovereign power transcends the limits fixed by the nomos. On the contrary, the epidemic state of emergency provoked by the god comes as an interruption to the sovereign exception, so the unlimited rights of Agamemnon. And the plague forces the sovereign to recognize the limits of his power as a condition to the return to normality. Yet, of course, in the Iliad, this normality continues to be characterized by the violence and arbitrariness of sovereign power. And as we know, the Agamemnon, after his conciliatory decision, immediately takes revenge on Achilles, causing the proverbial wrath of the hero from which all started. So that's why Achilles calls Agamemnon there an insolent and people-devouring king. So this is for the Iliad. If we now move to Oedipus, we find there at the beginning a plague that similarly raids through the city of Thebes. The people seek safety from the king, asking the sovereign to govern, which is interesting, not only on the land, but also on men and their life. This is kind of very Foucauldian. When Creon, sent by Oedipus to Delphi to ask the oracle for advice, returns to Thebes, he announces that Apollon asks, I quote, to expel from the land of Thebes an all defilement, miasma in Greek, where we are sheltering. It is a deathly thing beyond cure. We must not let it feed upon us longer. So this is the response of the oracle. It is then revealed, as we know, that this miasma and the cause of the epidemic is the unpunished murder of a previous king, Laios. The plague is a symptom of a hidden secret at the heart of a city. Its moral and political contamination is the real cause of its decay. So Oedipus wishes to bring what is dark to light, to bring to light this secret, and to re-establish the order of a nomos violated by the murder of Laios, putting thus an end to the pestilence. As we know, this wish turns against the sovereign, who comes to be identified with the miasma itself, and this reveals, in a very Agamemnian fashion, the secret solidarity between the sovereign and the outlaw, actually. At the end of the tragedy, the sovereign expels himself as an outlaw from the city in order to clean the political body from the contamination of a miasma and the plague. So, on the one hand, both Iliad's plague which is described as falling upon the people as a dark night, and King Oedipus plague, which rises from the people as a contaminating miasma. So both function as an exception to the sovereign exception. They point to the limits of sovereign power and the ruin which wait the trespassers of his limits. However, something is changed in the relation between sovereign power and exception from the Homeric period to Pericles' Athens, where Sophocles' tragedy was performed. While in the Iliad, the end of the pestilence provokes an immediate return of a sovereign hubris, in Oedipus, the sovereign outlaw bans himself permanently from the city. So there seems to be some modulation in this sovereignty issue that Agamben does not consider in his works. In Homer and Sophocles, the plague is a story, I would argue, of a sovereign exception, its excesses and their consequences. The biopolitical body of a people is present there only as a kind of passive place of sufferance for the mischiefs of its sovereign. If we turn now to Thucydides and Boccaccio, we see that this body becomes the real protagonist of a narration, while the figure of a sovereign disappears from the scene. This is interesting. The plague is here truly a state and space of exception. Boccaccio's half-dead creatures reeling about the streets of plague Florence evoke the uncanny threshold figure of Agambenian living deaths. But there is apparently no one to decide on this state of exception. What Agamben calls the idea of contagion is presented in both Boccaccio and Thucydides' narratives as the responsible in itself for the suspension of social norms. As Boccaccio writes, the intercourse was apt to convey the plague, from the sick to the whole. This is the idea of contagion. So the fear for the contagion rescinds social ties, provoking in an Agambenian fashion social distancing, and it dissolves the relations which held the city together. This is once again Boccaccio. Citizen avoid citizen. Among neighbors was scarce found any that shew fellow feeling for another. Kinsfolk held aloof and never met, or but rarely. We know it very well, this situation. We find the same idea in Thucydides, which presents it as a kind of dilemma. He says that if they were afraid to visit each other, they perished from neglect. If they ventured to do so, death was the consequence. Another dilemma that we know very well. So the final result of the dissolution of social bonds brought about by the plague is described by Thucydides as a lawless extravagance. It's also an interesting, so unfortunately I didn't look, but I think Michael would be very good to do this, to look into the Greek text, what was the Greek term for this. So lawlessness, it's the final results of this social distancing. And as Thucydides called it, says about it, the fear of gods or law of men, there was none to restrain them. Them is the citizens of Athens. And we find the same conclusion in Boccaccio. He writes that in this extremity of our city's suffering and tribulation, the venerable authority of laws, human and divine, was abased and all but totally dissolved. Every man was free to do what was right in his own eyes. So I would argue that the epidemic state of exception in Thucydides and Boccaccio's narrative establishes a parallel between the ruin and decay of a diseased physiological body, by the way both authors describe this in details, and the ruin and decay of a body politics. The plague does not punish the community for the mischiefs of a sovereign, but provokes the decomposition of society and the return of citizens to the disorder and chaos of a state of nature, where there are no limits to people's freedom, but in which they live and die as goats and sheep, as Thucydides and Boccaccio put it. So Thomas Hobbes notoriously described the state of nature as society ut tamquam dissoluta considerator, as if it were dissolved. And Agamben commented that the state of nature, I quote, did not necessarily have to be conceived as a real epoch, but rather could be understood as a principle internal to the state, revealed in the moment in which the state is considered as if it were dissolved. What then appears, continues Agamben, is in fact not the state of nature as an earlier stage into which man would fall back, but the state of exception. And he concludes that, I quote, the principle of preservation of one's own life is truly the innermost center of a political system. So in Thucydides and Boccaccio's plague narratives, the preservation of one's own life, the fear of contagion, emerges as the cause of a dissolution of a social bond. But what strikes us in those narratives is the total absence of sovereign power. There's no one to decide on this situation. There is no sovereign decision on the state of exception, but many individual, chaotic, and contradictory decisions of the citizens, which all concur to the dissolution of society. While the end of the epidemics remains out of the scope of the two narratives. It was the contrary in the case of Homer and Sophocles. So Boccaccio thus concludes that the best measure against the plague is to leave the city at all. So the voluntary golden exile of 10 young storytellers in the Decameron in a countryside villa is a kind, I would say, of escapist utopia, which restores an order only at the condition of abandoning the decomposing political body. So now a clear biopolitical turn in the approach to epidemics emerges only in modern plague narratives, which seems to confirm Foucault's hypothesis on biopolitics as a specific characteristic of the late modern period. Defoe and Manzoni, their plague narratives both focus on what Defoe calls the whole body of a people. He uses this expression, and in the same way, he talks about the exceptional kind of biosecurity, and I quote, measures for managing the people. This is Defoe's terminology. So we clearly see this idea already there. And they describe them during the pandemics, the epidemics. That is the matter of the whole Defoe's book and 2 chapters of Manzoni's novel. I put here into a table a long series actually. There are only some examples of offices, institutions, and public measures for the containment of epidemics that Defoe and Manzoni quotes directly from the chronicles of the times and for the orders of the authorities for the containment of epidemics. So there the function of all this is to govern the disorder of epidemic by establishing a new exceptional order which is fundamentally based on the separation of a sick from a healthy part of a body of a people. In Manzoni's narrative, the central institution for the administration of a sick part of a people body is Milano's Lazaret, the Lazzaretto, where the infected citizens are confined. From a Foucauldian perspective, it is interesting to observe that for Manzoni, the administration of a lazaret is a matter of government that he defines using the most exceptional of political terms, the term dictatorship. This is Manzoni's word. However, the authority of a lazaret's dictator, the Capuchin friar Felice Casati, is described by Manzoni in terms that remind us rather of what Foucault calls pastorals of power. Manzoni writes about this dictator that Father Felice, indefatigable in his labors, watched with unceasing and parental care over the multitude. He moved and ruled everything, and the dryads listened to complaints, threatened, punished, warned, comforted, dried tears, and cried. So social distancing, lockdown, isolation, reclusion, is here no more, like in Thucydides and Boccaccio, the chaotic reaction of a horrified people to the spread of a contagion. It is rather already a real state of exception based on the paradigm of biosecurity and decided upon by sovereign power in Agambennian terms. It governs the epidemic disorder through the exceptional establishment of a stricter order, control, surveillance for the administration of the whole body of a people. Defoe and Manzoni carefully observe the combined effects of the epidemic and its biopolitical containment on the social body, and this is, I think, particularly relevant for us today. The novelty in the novels is that the new biosecurity paradigm creates within the whole body of the people hidden enemies, which the healthy part of that body starts to chase and persecute. It is thus not by chance that Agamben begins his essay on contagion with a quote from Manzoni about the so-called untori, or poisoners, infected people who were accused of voluntarily and secretly spread the infection, according to a popular belief adopted and exploited by the authorities. So Manzoni describes in details the dark and disordered fear of the people, which quickly turns into the imagination of a conspiracy against biosecurity, embodied, as usual, in the figure of a stranger. Here are some quotes from Manzoni. In Defoe, this is even more sinister and resonates even more closely with the present pandemic and our biosecurity paradigm. His narrative clearly identifies the asymptomatic carriers of the virus as the most insidious, invisible enemy within the whole body of the people. There are different quotes about this. I will read only the first one. So there are people such as had received the contagion and had it really upon them and in their blood, yet did not show the consequences of it in their countenances, nay, even were not sensible of it themselves, as many were not for several days. This, says Defoe, breathed, it's interesting this idea of breathing, but in another sense, of course, yeah, breathed death in every place. Yeah. And Defoe also calls these asymptomatic carriers walking destroyers in the journal. So it is from this perspective interesting to consider the different attitude of Defoe and Manzoni towards the management of a people body during the epidemic state of exception. As a representative of Enlightenment rationality, Manzoni blames the mistakes of the city government for the belated and weak reaction in the containment of a contagion. the government of a Lazaret is for him a model of efficient management of a crisis and should have been extended to the government of an entire city. For Defoe, the biopolitical measures for the containment of a contagion are a necessary evil in a situation in which public security requires the limitation of individual freedom. He writes that it was a public good that justified the private mischief. Nevertheless, he expresses through his protagonist a very critical view of the most coercive measures and their unwanted effects on the people, particularly the shutting up of houses. So just a quote here, I believe then and do believe still that the shutting up of houses was by force and restraining or rather imprisoning people in their own houses was of little or no service in the war. Nay, I am of opinion it was rather harmful, having forced those desperate people to wander abroad with a plague upon them. This is Defoe's judgment on this measure. Moreover, Defoe's protagonist understands that the final result of a fear for an invisible internal enemy is the potential extension of surveillance and seclusion to the whole body of the population, as in our total lockdowns. Here is the quote, the relevant quote. And in this case, he is talking about the asymptomatic carriers of a virus. In this case, shutting up the well or removing the sick will not do it, unless they can go back and shut up all those that the sick had conversed with, even before they knew themselves to be sick. And none knows how far to carry that back or where to stop, for none knows when or where or how they may have received the infection or from whom. This synthesis really resonates with this is basically the same questions that Agamben asks 3 centuries later in the title of his collection of essays on the COVID crisis. A che punto siamo, he asks. That means actually, how far have we gone and where shall we stop? And now it's my time for stopping and concluding. So these were simply preliminary and kind of scattered remarks on plague narratives. But I think that they show that these narratives contain a lot of elements for a reflection on epidemics and biopolitics. Here are my kind of preliminary findings. First of all, as we saw and expected probably, explicitly biopolitical elements of epidemic management emerge only really in this late modern plague narratives, confirming Michel Foucault's vision of the late modern period as the time in which people's health first become a matter of government. So both in Defoe's Journal of a Plague Year and Manzoni's the proof that social distancing, isolation, and seclusion are measures for the administration of life in the epidemic state of emergency. But the more sinister potential of Agamben's sovereign exception in its biosecurity form also shines through in Defoe's, particularly in Defoe's critical remarks. In older narratives, there is almost no trace of biopower in Foucauldian sense. Although Boccaccio mentioned at the beginning of Decameron some measures, but only to state that, well, the epidemic was really unstoppable. They rather present interesting elements that point to the more distinctive aspects of Agamben's understanding of biopolitics and its relations with a state of exception. We find, I think, there are two opposite or maybe complementary ways of understanding the epidemic state of exception. In Thucydides and Boccaccio, plague narratives present a state of exception. The plague is a materialization of society as if it were dissolved, and of bare life, people dying like animals, without any sovereign decision. In Homer and Sophocles, the plague functions as an exception to the sovereign exception, I would say. The epidemic is not the excuse for the magnification of sovereign power, as Agamben suggests, but rather a trial to its excesses. The sovereign decision on the state of exception is required to reaffirm in a more or less stable manner the validity of the violated norms. So I think that's all, but just to say that next steps of this research could be, on the one hand, to deepen the analysis of single narratives, and on the other hand, to widen the scopes of the analysis to others of plague narratives, excluded from my preliminary choice. And the next step, the next step for generalization will be to make some conclusion about the theory of biopolitics that we have discussed, start to discuss on the basis of this narrative. So thank you.
So we have time for some questions. Somebody will break.
So thank you. Thank you, Daniele, for that terrific exposition. I guess my question is really about these last two, your research findings. In particular, I guess the first one, so the epidemic as a state of exception in bare life without any sovereign decision, coming out of Boccaccio.
Yeah.
I mean, the obvious question for me is, so where is what we are living? Where is that? I mean, is there, what do you think? I mean, is there a sovereign decision right now in terms of the epidemic? Mm-hmm. And where would it be? I mean, and the reason I ask is because, I'm thinking about, I don't know, Donatella De Cesare's work on, it's the virus itself, the COVID virus itself is sovereign, as opposed to some particular sovereign person. And I don't know, that seems to rhyme a bit with the Boccaccio and the Thucydides, Yeah. So I'd like to hear what you have to, how you might respond to that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this is a very important question. First of all, I'd say that they stretched this notion, of course, of a state of exception, because I guess within not only a Gambenian but also Schmittian perspective, a state of exception without a sovereign doesn't make a lot of sense. I didn't know this, but this would be a great way of framing it, the idea of a virus itself as the sovereign. And I think we see it in a way rather in Homer and Sophocles, because the virus is, the pestilence is the god. So, there is a clear and a higher level of sovereignty which intervenes in order to limit the lower level of sovereignty in a way. As for our situation, well, I think this is, in our case, is much clearer, at least in Europe. So there are many countries which actually declared a state of emergency. I think Italy is not even out of it. The state of emergency in Italy has not been revoked. And it is not been discussed at all. This is kind of incredible. So the populist a bit played with this idea, but for very, very little time at the beginning. Now it's forgotten that the country is living in a state of emergency. It's interesting the comparison with Estonia, where we had, I think, here a couple of months. So it was a state of emergency, and then they ended it, and there was a big discussion about what does a state of emergency means, and so on and so forth. So this is an interesting difference. But from this point of view, I think it is much clearer that it's really we have declared state of emergency, and we have a clear situation in which governments are increasing clearly their power. So they are legiferating, basically. The parliaments are simply confirming the decisions. They are not really making their jobs. But I think here it's yeah, it's in a way so clear. On the other hand, we have this, in our time, we have this local and global relation, but I think not a bit may make the situation more complicated. So this is what, I don't know, people like Negri, for instance, was trying to address when they say that, well, so there's no more local state sovereignty, but this empire and so on and so forth. So I think what is happening is actually now that the state is coming back. So, clearly with the pandemic, it's coming, the state is coming back, and we have to face once again this more state-based and sovereignty and all the problems that are related with it. But maybe, yeah, I mean, together with this is coming back also some idea of welfare, maybe. And once what Marco was mentioning, it's biopolitics needs not to be some kind of lethal. It can also be, so that maybe also this is also come. So now the question is that it's more this state of emergency side that will prevail, or more this welfare side of. I mean, in an Agambenian terms, and in the I don't agree with Agambens. They cannot be separated. But I think we can do a lot to push more in this welfare direction. And
I can speak without the microphone. Oh, I see. Thanks, Daniele, for this really, what a nice just roster of quotations I took, screenshots. So thank you very much for this very inspiring talk. I have a follow-up question to Timothy. And you know, it only now occurs to me that there might be a problem of translation involved here. To the extent that Agamben imported the notion of the state of exception from Carl Schmitt,
yeah.
Which, as far as I know, he did. Yeah. But you know, there might be the term
Ausnahmezustand.
Yeah. Ausnahmezustand. Yeah. The term existed in the German language before Carl Schmitt, obviously. Yeah. Carl Schmitt has turned it into something that then became a kind of theoretical staple subsequently. But German also has another word, Notzustand, which is the real state of exception. Yeah. The English state of emergency is by no means equivalent to Ausnahmezustand. Yeah. And so my question for you is, does Agamben ever attend to this very fine but important distinction? And the second question is, which ties in with this one, in practical terms, a state of emergency does not have to necessarily be equivalent to a state of exception. And you know, my own personal experience recently has been in New York City, where Governor Cuomo, while he was still governor, imposed a state of emergency for about, I don't know, a day, I think it was, where you couldn't go out with a curfew after, I think it was 8. Yeah. In New York, at least, nobody abided by this. Yeah. I mean, all of the dog walkers were out, the joggers were out, the cops were out seeing all of this. And I asked one of the policemen, so what's the deal with the state of emergency? He said, we have bigger fish to fry. This is, you know, will they kill anyone? Let them run. So, whereas the state of exception carries certain penalties, the state of emergency doesn't seem to. So my question is, you know, what are the political implications of these two terms and their practices that are, you know, tied in?
Yeah, thank you very much for this. I think Agamben addresses it explicitly, and he said that, I will use the term state of exception because of, once again, the etymology of a word, so this ex capere, including exclusion and so on and so forth. But, he says that, this is the notion of paradigm that he has. So there is an historical institution, which is the Notzustand, the state of emergency, which is in states, and then he take it as a paradigm, as an example of a bigger, so as he always does. So it's not simply a metaphor, but it's a real institution that can be used in exactly as the camp is the nomos of modernity, so the state of exception is the rule of our political order. And so that, yes, there is always, and I completely agree, there is always these risks, so that exactly there are these hyperbolic jumps that it does between a concrete, historical institution and these very abstract theoretical terms that would characterize a whole constellation of power. As for the reality, yes, of course, yes, exactly. That's where the devil always is, in these details. Actually, there is a state of emergency, but actually people are kind of ignoring it, the authorities included, so in a way. But I guess what Agamben would answer here is that, well, yes, but the state of emergency still allow you to, at any moment, this policeman can decide that, well, now I'm taking it seriously, and I will go and bring people somewhere or fine them for this. So the suspension of the law is there. So and then, of course, everyone decide what he or she does in this situation. That's I guess the bad thing. So that all these people decide to jog and to go out and nothing happen is good, but still the situation is created basically where almost everything may happen. So I guess this would be the way Agamben puts it. As for me, I don't know. So I mean, we can be very pragmatic and say that, well, actually, why care so much? So actually nothing is changing. But on the other hand, I think something still is changed. And it's not a new thing, this relation between legislative and executive power, of course. But what happened in the course of the pandemics is really has brought this to an extreme. So I mean, really the parliament are kind of exautorated from their function, basically, and this is really an issue. So I think I don't know what maybe in the U.S. the situation is a bit different, but in many European countries, basically.
Exciting discussion to just ask you to give a round of applause to Daniele.